Hey y'all, this is Sam with the Roots of Change podcast, and we have Joe Cardillo back on to talk tech and a hopeful future. Welcome back, Joe.
Good to see you, Sam. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm so glad to talk with you, and we're gonna really dig into it and geek out today because we were talking. We're always sharing different things about tech news and the growing fun oligarchy across this world, and how tech is really dominant, and how a lot of times we don't have as individuals like actual like tech power because of these monopolies. And so today we wanted to talk about how we do have power and to talk about a hopeful future, a hopeful internet, and that is rooted in reality, that is rooted in where we are now, which is very much a tech controlled by these big tech bros. So we do want to kind of focus a little bit more on like the future and how we are creating like actual steps both in our work as well as just like with other organizations and outside in the world, to build that hopeful future. So I'd love to like first start out with how we both came to loving tech, loving the internet, because I think one of the things that we talk about with a lot of like tech journalists is like big tech bros like to poo poo on us and say like, oh, we don't love tech, we're not future forward, and that it could be farthest from the truth.
Yeah, completely agreed. And I mean, I followed people who think about those kinds of questions consistently. Like, you already know this, Sam, but one of my favorite folks is Olia Lealina, who is a sort of an art and media and tech theorist and critic who lives in Eastern Europe. And she talks about like kind of one of her areas of genius and study is like the early web, like GeoCities and tripod websites. So for folks who aren't familiar, like imagine those kind of like early 90s websites. If you've never seen them, they have like hilarious GIFs and memes, and just like the quality of the web pages and the art is really like, kind of like those games that you can think of where they're very, basic pixel stuff. But it's just like a period of experimentation where you didn't have to be like super technical to set up a website. It didn't look amazing. And it wasn't super, fantastical at reaching millions of people, but it didn't need to be, right? You just had like your website, you connected to other websites, you had fun, you got into different topics. And so I kind of got into the web through that sort of portal myself. And like a lot of other people, experiences with like early kind of microblogging sites or blogging sites like LiveJournal and things like that. And, at its heart, those things are very like creative, exploratory, connected places. And you'd meet somebody else who was really into like that sci-fi series that you were really into, or whatever other kind of arcane thing that you were into, like pictures of trains and things like that. And so I have like a warm spot in my heart when I think back to that version of the web. Before everything was like, how do I order, a $10 meal and pay a $40 tip to get it delivered, which is sort of the shitty web that we have now. And there's something so much better about, that early web and some of those experiences that are sort of pre that, monopolistic stuff. And of course, like I'm nostalgic in a way, but also there's lots of good stuff that's still being created that's like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely get very nostalgic about like what we're talking about is kind of like the social networking era of the internet, which was much more about the networking. It was about the community and the art and the creativity. And it was what I loved most is that niche, like you found your people. And I was a queer two-spirit kid growing up in Dallas, Texas, in a very white Christian world. And the internet was my way out, like stories for sure, TV, media. That's why I love all of that. But the internet was a way for me to tap into my queerness in a way that I had not been able to do before. And that happened on Tumblr. And so if you remember Tumblr like before Yahoo, before like Melissa Mayer just destroyed that company, there was just a lot of joy there, and there was a lot of like connectivity and finding each other. And I think a lot of that, really birthed the kind of queer and trans movements that we see today of being able to be a lot more loud and proud on the internet. And of course, we're seeing people trying to shadow ban and a lot of that now. But that is because that early social networking was so important to like young queer kids and other folks who are just trying to find themselves.
Yeah, and I love the concept of just like, I mean, I think if I were to boil it all the way down, it's like one of the very best parts about it is that you could sort of like have a thought or a question and be like, I wonder if someone else had this thought or question. And like, if you grow up in a small town in Missouri, like you might not be able to find someone else who had that question, right? Or, someplace in Texas or whatever the case might be. And so the web was like it was and is a way to be like, oh wow, there's someone else having this super funny, interesting thought, or they've thought about this question too, and just that sense of like community and connection is, I mean, it's just really significant. And I think there's still ways to do that, but it's very, very hard on bigger platforms. And so I think a lot of people are thinking about like that reconnection to that kind of experience.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'd love to like get a little bit into like why the big tech platforms aren't those places, because I think one of the biggest things that I'm seeing in the community is just like a reluctance to get off big tech. And I get it. We've been trapped into these platforms. My friends are on big tech, all of the people I follow, the organizations, the way I organize, like it's all in one place. But that place is hiding the content that we actually want to see. It is making our mental health worse off. It is disconnecting us even more because we're spending more time on our phones thinking that that is connection when in reality we could be out organizing in person. And no shade on that, of course. Like there are so many ways of organizing. I definitely want to touch in on the accessibility part. And, you and I have talked about that a lot, about how the internet does offer the accessibility. So I think it's kind of a balance. And I'd love to hear your perspective about how big tech really allow for that, and kind of what is your message to folks who are looking for that community, that niche kind of, I need to be seen, I need to know that I have, folks who are like me out in the world. How do we get that without these big tech platforms?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess I would think about that in two ways. The first way is sort of about friction, and that um, like zero resistance, zero difficulty, zero growth is not necessarily very good for us or very interesting or fun or engaging. And so that's like a primary principle for big tech design. Like, I mean, product design for the last 15 years has sort of been about reducing friction and making everything easy. And I make the joke all the time, like, Alexa, can you solve like the Ukraine Russia war by like 4, because I don't have time, I got to get to dinner at 5, so if you could just solve this geopolitical problem real quickly. I make those jokes all the time because that's the kind of person I am. But um, friction is meaningful. It's a good thing. It has value in our lives, and so I think that's one really big sort of thread is, we have to sort of embrace that and learn from it. And of course, there are other ways to say that, right? There's discomfort. There's pushback, etc. There's accountability. Like these are all things that we learn from in our lives. And if you want to be like a happy person and feel good and mess around with like good things in your life and good people, you're going to need some friction as part of that
Yeah.
experience. And so I think that's one thread. And then I think the other thread is like, ultimately there need to be lots of experiences and roles in life as a person that have nothing to do with whether it's going to be monetized or it's going to make some money or not. So I think those two things, like, I mean, there's a lot of other aspects to it. Those two things are the two big sort of, strengths, that when we think about like, how do I get to a better place with tech in my life? And also just for us, like at a large level, like those two things are really.
Yeah. Yeah. I really like that point about friction, because I think I look at friction as like there's two different things about friction, and like there's the real world and then there's the big tech world, and big tech talks about things in a very sanitized way, and so they are saying that they're reducing friction, but I would say that they actually don't do that because the user experience is so bad on all of these platforms. And like, you know, you and I have talked about the enshittification of the internet and these platforms and the intentionality behind that to build profit. But there's that there's two ways to look at that, right? Like the experience is getting worse, and so technically the friction is getting there's more friction. However, when I think about big tech friction, I think about it from like a plastic perspective, you know, like it's not real. It's like AI. It is this weird sterile environment. Instagram is the way Instagram is. So if I'm an artist and I'm creative and I want to draw outside of the box, I literally cannot draw outside of the box because it's an Instagram box. And so like we are having to build art and creativity within these systems that aren't designed for that, because again, we had social networking, we had that creativity that was like really a flow of information. We didn't have algorithms, we didn't have big tech and certain people defining what is popular, what is needed in these systems. And I think that's a really important distinction when we talk about friction, because that's the big techification of friction. However, if we like go outside in the real world, friction is missing your bus and having actually a really great conversation with the shop clerk that turns into something else, that turns into, you know, a delight in your day. And that is something that we need to strive for.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And like, I was, as you were describing that, I was kind of like laughing to myself a little about, boy, I sure hope that like the experience of the future isn't just like a Starbucks and an Olive Garden on every corner, and we've gotten rid of all the other restaurants. Because like technically, you can go to Starbucks and Olive Garden and have coffee and food, not, you know, technically speaking, but like most of us, and I am ragging on them a little bit, but I'm not ragging on them just like completely, because like, you know, diversity is important. Diversity and experience and food and creativity and all those things. And like, not everything can be about like, let's extract the absolute most money possible from selling people breadsticks. Like, that is not the purpose of food, you know, at the end of the day. Um, and so it's like, you know, just like having that kind of, you know, I think part of what you're talking about, which I think is an interesting, I guess I would call it sort of like mid-web, like is discovery, right? We're talking about discovery. Like, what is the process for discovery? And so, like, you know, there's that early web wave, then you get that mid-web web wave where things like Delicious and Dig and these other kind of, they're not quite social networking sites, but like bookmarking sites and things like that, allowed people to sort of discover things and people and ideas. And there's something really lovely about that, you know, that ability. But like discovery now is on the web is sort of on the big web is sort of dead because, you know, if it didn't make a lot of money, you know, if it wasn't 100x revenue opportunity, they just got rid of it. Like, and I'm not saying there's no product designers at these big companies that still care about that. It's just like they're not allowed to do that, right? Or they've been driven out. So that discovery piece, I think, is a really important aspect of that too. And that's a very human thing that we all.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll just touch on the human part of that too, because I was listening to Cory Doctorow speak on the Intercept podcast, and um, I there's so much happening underneath that a lot of regular folks who are using tech every single day have no idea about. And as you know, you and I have grown up in this industry, like we've seen a lot of things, and so we understand the internal machinations of these big tech companies. But I'm thinking about, you know, the humanness and the employees. And over the course of time, what we've seen is as these big tech companies have become more and more monopolistic, the employees have less and less power, because one, they never were unionized. There was never a drive to understand that, quote, white collar workers in the office are also the same as folks on the farm and folks out doing like labor jobs, because we should all be looking at unions as a solution. But because that didn't happen, when the tech companies really kind of hit a point of like DGAF, don't give a fuck, like they this was like what, in 2020 really is when the pandemic hit, and they were like, we could just do whatever we want, we don't need these regulations. They stopped listening to their employees, if they ever were in the first place. And so now there's this really precarious situation happening in Silicon Valley and other big tech places, because these employees don't have any like power, and they're being told by their bosses how to run the companies. And then again, going back to the human part, their bosses aren't rooted in reality. They aren't experiencing the world the way most folks are. And so they're giving directions that are just not going to be long-term supportive for the end user, or for anyone for that matter.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think you're touching on, like, I mean, one of the most important things in order for tech to work is to have a diverse set of people, backgrounds, experiences, languages, faiths, beliefs, perspectives, creating that tech. Otherwise, you create a monochrome version. And look, Sam, you know this because you worked in venture back tech, and I was there for a good decade. Like, the people who have the most amount of money, and the investors, and a lot of the founders who sort of have the like money and the time and the backing to build things in the first place. Like, I mean, this is like, tech at some point sort of made that like, that sort of overture, like, oh, we're going to try to like embrace diversity, but they never really did it, right? Because if you're a Black founder or a Latina founder, for example, you couldn't get funded to build the kinds of companies that like people like Zuckerberg, got funded to build. And those platforms are like reflect the very narrow viewpoints and perspectives and desires of people like Mark Zuckerberg. And ultimately, that's really bad for discovery. It's bad for like connection. It's bad for humanity. It's bad for creativity. And I think, I was laughing a little bit because before we got on this, I was thinking about like the phrase detoxing. Like, people talk about detoxing from social media. What they're really talking about is like reconnecting with humans and humanity and creativity.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like, I think the detoxing piece, and we were talking about this, and the way that you framed it makes a lot of sense. Of like, we have to, like, in order for connection to happen, there needs to be space for connection. And that actually goes back to the friction part. If we don't have any friction, then we're not building connection. We're not living human lives, because if we are controlling our lives, then there's no room for like good things, good surprises to happen as well. And so that's where I think about detoxing as like by getting rid of and detoxing from social media, you now have free time, and you're opening up that space for more community to come in. And so it's less of that like kind of negative, like I have to give this up. It's like, what am I gaining? What am I opening up? But you keep talking, because I know you had a little bit more around that, and I don't want to steal your thunder.
No, I mean, I didn't really have a lot more. I guess just like thinking from a discovery perspective. I mean, okay, I'll just name three things that I really like about the internet. And then maybe if you want, you can add some. Um, one thing I really like is, and this, I'm seeing this on Mastodon a lot now, which makes me very happy, is I do actually like some of these kinds of like super niche accounts. The internet is the internet because we have cats, right? There wouldn't even be a World Wide Web without cats. Let's just be real. But there also wouldn't be a really wonderful World Wide Web without like capybaras, because like there's an account on Mastodon that posts like a few capybara photos a day, which I love. I've never met one other than at the zoo, and they don't belong there. I think they should be out in the wild, but that's another conversation. There's also a really great account that just posts like 8 to 12-second clips of trains, a lot of trains in South America and Europe, which I love. So like that's a really wonderful thing, is it just like opens the door to the world in that way. I think another thing is it does introduce, as you were kind of pointing to, like good friction. Because another account that I really love is, I can't quite remember the name of it, but on Mastodon, they just post photos and videos of like punk rock shows from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And it's really awesome. Also, some of those places were super messy, and people had really like, messed up lives. And, punk rock, of course, there's lots of drug use, alcohol, etc. So just like a place that introduces conversation about that, which is good friction, right? To be thinking about and learning from those experiences. And then a third thing I really love is, and I think you can kind of see this a little bit on Mastodon, which I like because it goes back to early Twitter, is like people talking about science on the internet, which is one of the absolute best things the internet can do. Because science is messy and complicated, and there's a lot of it. And so, like, I've been very happy to see a lot of scientists join Mastodon and the Fediverse, kind of the greater decentralized set of, Mastodon-like apps. Because once the scientists arrive on the internet, like, then you're having some crazy, funny, weird, awesome conversations about, like, did you know that this atom or this molecule actually got discovered in this way? And nobody knew it was going to be good for this, but it turns out, things like that. So those are like just examples of the kinds of amazing things that I think the web can be good for, and it still could be good for, if those folks are allowed and encouraged to do those kinds of activities, and it doesn't require, like, oh, well, I'm sorry, that's not going to fit into the algorithm, or there's just no way we can make 100x revenue on, weird capybara photos. Yeah, we know that. That's not the point. So those kinds of things, I think, are examples of things that I really love about the web. And I think they still can exist, and we should encourage and promote them.
Yeah. I mean, I think they're vital to life. Like if we're not doing something goofy and ridiculous, then like we're not really living. We cannot be robots. That's like literally the opposite point of being a human being. And I definitely echo what you shared. And I think what came to mind was like my favorite thing is coming onto Mastodon now, and previous versions of that, like Reddit for me is also one of those where you can get really geeky. But just to come on and be like, I have no idea what this person said, and it's like so humbling, but you just learn so many cool and random things. Like I really am enjoying that on Mastodon, of like connecting with different people and this having that like deep niche knowledge about something. It's so humbling, because I think an alternative to that, of course, is big tech, which is like rah rah rah, look at me, I'm the smartest person in the room, don't listen to them, I know everything, right? And it's like that's like not how we should be working, because isn't it great that like this scientist can like do all of these things over in Norway, and then I'm over here and I have this niche, understanding of like media and communications and tech. And what is that combined together? What does that make us? And so I think the decentralized internet, and I know we'll get to that a little bit, of like kind of the solutions of like how do you actually detox, is there's just a lot more delight, and there's a lot more learning and humbling of like just it feels so antithetical to the Instagrams and the TikTok algorithms.
Yeah, and another slightly more serious example that I like is that local news is starting to kind of like thrive on Mastodon too. And there's so much one could say about journalism and just like the arc of history and all that. Um, and I have a lot of doubts about a lot of our really big national news publications. Um, but I think local news is and I'm a proponent and have been an advocate for local news for many years. And have been a journalist at times, did a little bit of that in my past, and like seeing publications like the Mississippi Free Press sort of embrace having their own presence on the Fediverse. And I get it. I know that most people are not going to embrace like independent social media. It's just like, as you were saying earlier, it seems like work. And let's be super real. We all kind of love the idea that our audience could exponentially grow like immediately because we might be favored by the algorithms or whatever. You know, uh, those things aren't even really viral. They're just selected in that way. But I love the idea that there are these local news publications that are like, reporting on like how, not just the accountability stuff, because that's important to city council, county commission, oil spill, whatever's happening, but also like, wow, one of our neighbors like just put together this project to, go around the town and pick up fresh fruit that's like not getting picked and then deliver that to people who are hungry. Like that's like the definition of what local news should be covering in a way. So I think there's so much promise and a lot of good things that can happen. But ultimately, like being dependent on like a Facebook group or next door to make that happen, and then they shut it off or turn it off when there's no money to be made at that high level scale. We need 100x profits or whatever. I mean, that's just silly. It's just ridiculous because it devalues our humanity. And I think that we could do so much better than that together in those ways. So, I'm an advocate for that for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'd love to like kind of turn it to the more actionable piece of that, because like I think we're talking about Mastodon, and I don't want to only focus on Mastodon because that's obviously not the only solution. Like ultimately, what does that mean for local news, for organizations, for people who are trying to get their message out? Um, like how do they start to detox from like Instagram? One of the biggest things that I see is like there's so many organizers and activists and creatives on Instagram, and they're like, "Hey, come to my art show. Here's my show." And that's the only place they're promoting their like protest or their organizing event. And I'm like, "You're missing me. You're completely missing a huge portion of the population of people who like actually would want to get organized and engaged, but because you're on this platform that is only insular, you're missing out." And so I guess what are the lessons from a leadership perspective? Like how do we start moving away?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you want it easy and at scale, um, you're just going to have to go to the next big tech platform to get that, right? Like if you want it to be slick and easy and to reach a ton of people, like you're just going to be cool hunting for the rest of your life. And I mean, ultimately, I don't really recommend that. So there's that piece. But like, just to give you a more practical example, I'm a big fan, as you were kind of pointing to earlier, of like labor and working people. And, unions aren't the only solution to creating kind of balanced power in our economy, but they're a great one. They're a really strong one and they're useful. And so, I recently started maintaining like a Signal channel with just like, union rallies, events, demonstrations, etc. And I don't know, it's not really rocket science. Like I go to things, I see people, I ask what they're up to. I'm excited to hear about it. I share their flyers. I connect other people with those things. Because I think it's inspiring, to see working people collaborate and have power together. I think it's great. There's nothing quite like seeing like baristas be like, fuck yeah, we serve your coffee. Like we should be paid a fair wage. I'm like, yeah, I'm with that. Tell me about it. I'm down for that. So like I just maintain a Signal channel for that. And I need to start some other presences for that. But I think just embracing and welcoming more, more email newsletters, more, independent social media, more use of messaging apps like Signal that are not controlled by billionaires, more flyers, more zines, more, you've been doing this, more offline stuff. And don't worry if it's going to reach 1 million people. Like, do you need to reach 1 million people? Are 1 million people going to come to your art show? No, absolutely not. If your, super amazing cheese sculptures go viral, that's super cool. But like, are 50,000 people going to buy your cheese sculptures? No, absolutely not. Find your people, connect with people who care about the stuff that you care about. And, in a way, it's just like, forget about all that, that kind of like, building a company town, being the venture capital billionaire owner of everything. Like, stop trying to control things or predict things. Just like build things that have value and connect with people. And I don't think that there's any secret to that. I think it's just like slowing down and doing it a little bit differently and trying some different tools, and some will work and some won't.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's good advice. I wanna like put a pin on some of the more like practical tips because I have some more thoughts on that. But I think like when it comes to like the strategy of what you're naming is we have to ask ourselves, what are we really trying to accomplish? Like this is it. This is the thing for communicators and organizations. And I think we're in a huge crisis point within like the nonprofit industrial complex, political, anything where there is social change involved and structures of power. They're really struggling right now. And I think if you are an organization that is struggling with that, your communication, with your strategy, with how to move forward in this moment, get back to the root of why you are even existing in the first place. Like, what are you trying to accomplish? Because I guarantee you, like, your one organization is not going to solve world hunger. That's a much larger issue. That's a political issue. But can you tangibly say, I am supporting folks within this region and we are getting like this many meals out the door? You know, that is like the tangible piece of being able to identify the real world impacts of your communications. And then that takes you back to, well, what is our strategy then in the first place? Because if our strategy is not to blast this out and make sure that thousands of people see it, and it's actually, we really want 20 people at this event to garden for us, well, then how are you going to accomplish that in a way that is a lot more connective and more heart forward to get people to engage instead of just click that button and like it? And that's something that I've been thinking about a lot. And I'll pause here, but like one of the things that I'm also thinking about is slow productivity, because we've done a lot of communication around like how I work and how the Roots of Change is built around slow productivity for that long-term future visioning. But I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking a little bit of like some of the work that you've done, and the reminders that you've given people about organizing, and especially on get out the vote and kind of civic engagement work. Um, just like the importance of having genuine, real one-to-one connections with people, and also of understanding what an action is and what actions you want people to take. Because just putting this in the lens of like social communicators for a second, specifically, um, I think, we've all sort of been inundated with this, like, what's your reach? What's your potential audience? And that's, very much a big social media tech thing. And we're all like, my reach is 70 million. And it's like, yeah, what is that? What does that mean? And, I don't know. I mean, none of us know, right? And granted, I'm, fairly well versed, having done a lot of marketing and comms. Like, I understand analytics pretty well. And even I don't quite know, because that's the word reach is defined differently by different, tech platforms. Um, so I think being really intentional and like coming down to the root and thinking about like what are the actions that we really want people to take. And I don't, I think for social communicators, it's like it actually goes back to more organic things, like, having people come to a workshop, having people call someone or connect in some way that is like meaningful and measurable. Because content metrics, you know, thumbs up, thumbs down, view time and things like that are not great indicators right now, because AI and all of these sort of big tech CEOs who are not the world's smartest people are, pouring sort of crap into our lives and calling it like, success. And so if we're not very clear about our actions and our activities and that genuine connection, and what actions do we want to take, and do we want other people to take? Like, we're just going to be subject to like, wow, our content is doing amazing, but it turns out it's not doing amazing with people for any real reason. It's just like getting flown through a bunch of AI Slack channels. That's of no value to anybody, at the end of the day. So I think just being like really, really intentional, to your point of going back and looking at the actions that we value, and I think also asking our communities what those actions are that they want to see have happen is the other big part of it too. So yeah, I don't know if you have thoughts about that too, just like how do we measure what really matters? I think a lot of it is going back to stuff that you've been talking.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we could have a whole podcast about analytics, and I would love to do that one day because I love analytics, and this just watching the decimation of the analytics and like the way big tech has just really manipulated that is just, it's so frustrating because people don't know what they're talking about when they're talking about reporting and analytics. The biggest thing about this moment right now is all of us have been trained by big tech, and that is something that most folks are not recognizing, and it's like the hardest thing about my work is getting through that one point, because it could be a socialist organization, it could be an organization who is like working with a very minute population. Like, I am having these conversations with countless different people, and a lot of the hiccup is, well, we already know how to do our strategy. And my question is, like, whose strategy is it? Is it your strategy or is it big tech strategy? Because you're doing big tech strategy wonderfully. You are producing content for them. You are helping them make money. You're helping your friends stay on their platforms and making money for them. If that's your organization, like, you need to ask yourself, and like, that's a really hard conversation to have, but it's one we have to have right now. And I'll give an example and then I'll turn it back to you. But, I am constantly reaching out to different folks for this podcast to interview. And we're really interviewing, like, the focus here is about, like, who are the people who are doing things differently? Who are the people who are pointing to the systems and the structures and saying, like, that's not the way we can move forward. So that means that I'm reaching out to a bunch of different types of people. And sometimes I'm reaching out to folks who are a little bit more influencer-y than like a local organization. And when I reach out to those, they're asking me, well, what are your numbers? And then what are your social channels? Can you give me a link to your Instagram? And I'm like, I can give you a link to my Instagram, but it's not going to tell you what you need to know, because that follow number is really low, because I don't organize on Instagram. My focus is not to raise that number for Instagram. My focus is to connect with people, to help them understand how to move forward and use their magic to build a better world. That is not tied to Instagram in any way. So I've lost out on a lot of, podcast opportunities, other things, because I don't have the right reach. And honestly, like, as I've done that work, I'm like, that's great. I don't want you on the podcast, because if you're asking that question, then we're fundamentally misaligned. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I worked in venture-backed startups, so I love growth experiments. Like, there's no two questions about that one. I'm always interested in, like, how do you connect in a way that's meaningful. But I think audience building and monetization are like not a very creative endeavor in big tech, in sort of the world we have. And I was sort of talking about some kind of funny, weird experiments earlier, like capybara photo account or an account with trains. There's so many different examples. And that's not for everybody, but like halved experiments, I think, is also really important for brands to be like connecting in different ways and learning as they go along. Because I think that's the primary purpose. Like, audience building is something that happens as a byproduct of what you're learning to do to connect, right? Like, if your audience grows, that's great, but that's not the goal. The goal is to do things that connect you with people in a meaningful way, and then you have that audience build. And of course, if it's completely like an AstroTurf situation where you got to buy, audiences, or you have to sort of not talk about certain things and suppress certain kind of ideas or concepts or content, then you're in a really, then you're in an ecosystem that's not healthy. We can see that with our app marketplaces with the Apple Store and Android, the Google
Yeah.
Play Store. That certain things are fine and other things you can't talk about or create or whatever. So ultimately, like, I think, I think that part of it is also a little bit generational. Like, we have to be really straightforward. Like the next two sort of biggest mover generations, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, like they're already over a lot of that. They already kind of recognize it because you have to deal with it. You're subject to it all the time, and I respect that. So I think, like, a lot of it is really about, like, what are you measuring, and what are your. It goes back to the strategy piece you were talking about. I don't. I think the biggest thing is, like, have a strategy, have that strategy include enough diversity in the way that you're using it, and reaching people, and also have enough experiments in it so that as you learn, you can switch things in or out. That's never been, that's always going to be in style to have that perspective and to be living and working in that way. And some people they're going to astroturf. They're going to buy their way into whatever they consider to be real. But, like, at the end of the day, like, you can buy an audience all you want. It's going to cost you on the other side.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's like when going back to the measurement piece of it, like I think we don't need to be tied to concrete numbers because again, I think that goes back to like the control. It's like, do you want liberation or do you want control? And the big tech platforms are offering control. But if we're trying to build liberatory strategies, we need to think about that in a liberatory sense. And so, like, your ideas around like having a certain amount of your time or your money or your platforms be about testing, about having fun, about like you've got like maybe you stay on Instagram, you keep posting on Instagram, but start your signal channel. Like, you don't have to have hundreds of people, thousands of people on your signal channel. Like maybe you're reaching 5 people, but that's going to grow as you keep telling people about the signal channel. And so I think like there are creative ways for us to just kind of think outside the box while doing like continuing to maintain the work and also building into the new areas. And then the last thing that I'd say is around time and just knowing that like none of us have really the time that we want to do all of this. And so what I would say to folks is like don't stress, like really feel more expansive about how you're doing communications, like make it fun, make it creative, make it something that you're curious about versus being tied to outcomes, because that in the long run is going to help you build content that is going to be more engaging for folks.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And, like, I mean, something that's kind of funny to me, like, I actually really appreciated that a lot of these huge companies had creator programs. Like, they built out these sort of creator friendly fellowship or whatever other kind of programs. I thought that was really smart. I think they mostly thought about it as a PR move, really, and an audience building, which again goes to everything we've just talked about. I actually thought that was a really smart move, and then a lot of them got rid of their creator programs, which I think is like one of the silliest things that you can do. Because if you are really connecting with real creative people, I'm not talking about like people who are just really, really, really good at audience building, because that's a skill and that's a thing, but that's not necessarily a creative art. But like people who are deeply experimental in the way that they connect with their audiences and that they learn, and that when they do creative work, they do it with people and for people, not just, to kind of exploit. That's such a talent and such an incredible benefit and value. And so, like, that's an example of something that, like, is hilarious that these huge tech companies used for a minute and then discarded. Like, if I'm a brand, I'm definitely going to continue to have like a creative program. It might be structured in different ways, but like that's so important because Here I'm thinking a little bit of like the, artist in residence programs or musician in residence or things like that. And, there's a lot of creative ways to do that kind of stuff. But yeah, those are the kinds of things that are going to continue to have a lot of power at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a good place to like wrap. And I think like what you're pointing to is like humanness versus AI, and humanness is going to win out in the long run. Like this AI bubble, whatever you want to call it, is going to burst, and people are going to want something that is more human and more connective. So if you're leading on that, then you're already ahead of the game. And I love that idea too. Like, I just want to put a pin on that one for organizations because last week we shared some fundraising tips, some like community based fundraising tips. And I think a lot of folks are asking, should we invest in AI right now? And the answer is no. The answer is invest in people. So, to your point, if you are asking, we have this chunk of money, should we put it towards AI? Put that chunk of money towards creative artists who are going to like post on your social media and get people
Completely
excited.
agree. I completely agree because like if you're going to use AI at all, which I think is debatable. Some people are like, I'm not touching it. Some are, full proponents. Like, I think what we're seeing with AI right now is more of like a 15 to 20% thing, and not like 1,000x value. You know, AI tools and apps to help you like just do your basic proofreading and checking content. Okay, I can see the value. That's like a 15 to 20% value, or something like that. But like wasting all your money on that instead of like, to your point, putting money into creative people and into people, community people, and into like work that is really meaningful, like, that's ridiculous. Don't do that. Like, invest in people. I completely agree with you on that.
Yeah. I think let's end on that one because I think that's the message. Invest in people, invest in humanity and humanness, and that's where we're going to find the future of the internet.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel that.
Cool. Well, with that, y'all, I hope you stay rooted.